and welcome. My name is David Fathi. I'm the director of the ACLU National Prison Project. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to Banking on Bondage, Private Prisons, and Mass Incarceration. I'd like to extend a special welcome to the Congressional staff members who have taken the time from their schedules to be with us this afternoon. Right at the outset, as a matter of full disclosure, I want to make clear that the American Civil Liberties Union opposes the delegation of the state's power to incarcerate to private for-profit corporations. Indeed, I'm proud to say that the ACLU adopted official policy opposing private incarceration in 1987, which really was the infancy of the private prison phenomenon here in the United States. Even at that time, 25 years ago, the ACLU Board of Directors, in adopting that policy, recognized and articulated several of the dangers of private prisons that our speakers will discuss today. So, for example, they noted that private prisons are likely to have an adverse impact on substantive and procedural legal rights and remedies of prisoners. They noted that it is likely that a private prison will not comply with all relevant health and safety standards. And perhaps most germane to our discussion today, they noted that private prisons are likely to result in inappropriate confinement or an inappropriate increase in the use of incarceration as a sanction. Well, private prisons have come a long way since 1987. In 1980, private prisons for adults did not exist on American soil. By 1990, there were 67 private prisons holding about 7,000 prisoners. In the next 20 years, from 1990 to 2009, the population in private prisons grew by a staggering 1,600%, from 7,000 to about 129,000 prisoners. And private prisons have become a multi-billion-dollar industry that operates not only here in the United States, but all around the world. Now, the figures I just cited apply to state and federal prisons in the aggregate. The growth has been even more dramatic if we look just at the federal sector alone. And so as recently as 1990, the Federal Bureau of Prisons did not house any prisoners in for-profit institutions. 5 years later, by 1995, still, there were only about 1,000 federal prisoners in private prisons. But by 2009, that figure had grown 33-fold to 34,000 prisoners, or about 16% of the total federal prison population. And today, on any given day, private facilities hold nearly half of the approximately 32,000 people held in federal immigration detention. So these issues would be important for us to talk about at any time. But as it happens, they are particularly timely now. Just last week, the Florida Senate narrowly defeated what would have been the largest wholesale prison privatization in U.S. history, involving 14,000 prisoners in 24 facilities. And also last week, we learned that the President's 2013 budget for the Federal Bureau of Prisons includes funding for the acquisition of an additional 1,000 private prison beds. We're very fortunate today to have a distinguished panel of experts to discuss private prisons from a range of perspectives. We're going to have each panelist speak for about 15 minutes, which should leave plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So please do hold your questions until all panelists have had a chance to speak, and then we very much look forward to hearing from all of you. Our first speaker is Bill Mefford, who is Director of Civil and Human Rights of the General Board of Church and Society of the United Methodist Church. He helps to build movements to defend the rights of immigrants, as well as to end mass incarceration and bring about criminal justice reform. He also advocates for an end to gun violence, for religious freedom, and for abolition of the death penalty. Bill came to the General Board of Church and Society in 2006. and has spent his life serving the local church in a variety of positions. He has been a youth pastor, a pastor, Wesley Foundation director, and an urban missionary in several cities, including Chicago, Cleveland, and Waco, Texas. Bill graduated from McMurray University in Abilene, Texas in 1990. He received a Master's of Divinity from Asbury Theological Seminary in 1998, and a Doctor of Missiology, also from Asbury, in 2008. Bill Mefford.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thanks, David, and thanks to David Shapiro and the rest of the staff at ACLU for putting this together. Appreciate y'all being here. Let me first start, though, by saying, like most people of faith, United Methodists express their concern for people who are impacted by a broken criminal justice system by serving those most directly impacted. So let me tell you about a few of our folks. In Oklahoma, with Criminal Justice and Mercy Ministries led by the Reverend Stan Basler, he started churches in several areas of Oklahoma that are made up of those who are currently incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, their families, and those on the outside. They work with those who are currently incarcerated to prepare them for life on the outside, as well as the children of those incarcerated, so that families can be strengthened and recidivism can be reduced. Reverend Anika Jones is the pastor of Impact Church in Atlanta, Georgia, and has spent 11 years leading spiritual development sessions at women's prisons and has developed reentry initiatives with women who have come out of prison to help those who are going to come out so that, again, recidivism can be reduced and families can be strengthened. Reverend Anthony Everett lives in Lexington, Kentucky, and has started a church called Nia Community of Faith. He seeks to empower Lexington's persons of African descent to transform their lives and the lives of others through ministry and Christian discipleship driven by the movement of God. Reverend Basler, Reverend Jones, Reverend Everett are all United Methodists, and just a picture of the thousands upon thousands of other United Methodists who seek to build movements among the rest of the United Methodists to end mass incarceration. So I start with just a few examples of the missional work of United Methodists throughout the country who are committed to ministries of healing and restoration for the millions who are impacted by a broken criminal justice system to set the stage. You see, we had these folks in mind when we realized in May of 2011 that the United Methodist Church owned nearly $1 million of stock in Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, and GEO Group. It truly was a sickening realization. Dispensing justice not as a public trust, but rather as an item for sale in the marketplace has dramatically accelerated the incarceration of mass numbers of people, particularly people of color. While United Methodists have been caring for those in prison and fighting to lessen the number of people incarcerated, our church has at the same time been profiting from corporations making billions of dollars from the incarceration of people of color. To see why this is such a problem, we can take a look at a report by National Public Radio that came out in March of last year, which centered on the largest juvenile facility in the country, Walnut Grove, Mississippi, which is owned by GEO Group. NPR's report gives us a picture of why the work of private prisons is so diametrically opposed to the work of the United Methodist Church, and I believe of all faith groups. NPR's report of the Walnut Grove facility is a picture of a facility permeated with violence. Part of the reason for the violence was that even while the population of Walnut Grove increased, the number of staff working at that facility continued to decrease. While the common guard to inmate ratio at other facilities is typically 1 to 10, 1 to 12, Walnut Grove's ratio fell to 1 to 60. Why? Because staff salaries are a huge expenditure. David Shapiro, in his excellent study, which is many of you have, Baking on Bondage, writes that certain empirical studies show a heightened level of violence against prisoners in private institutions, which may reflect, in part, the higher rate of staff turnover in private prisons, which then results in inexperienced guards. End quote. So this is back to me. So when profits are at stake, and you can keep costs down through maintaining lower numbers of staff, safety becomes a luxury. Walnut Grove began as a juvenile facility housing 13 to 18-year-olds only. Since then, the Mississippi State Legislature has raised the age limit to 22 years old, which coincidentally expanded the number of people who are housed there, which coincidentally expands the profits for GEO Group. While they raised the age of those who are housed in juvenile facilities, the United Methodist Church at the same time was strongly advocating against housing children with adults, because we know that keeping children separated from adults holds a greater chance for youth to not end up in the adult criminal justice system. We know that children housed with adults are more likely to be victimized by violence, by sexual violence, and are more prone to commit suicide than our children who are housed separately from adults. So Walnut Grove provides a clear picture of how the interests of private prisons are in direct contrast with the mission of the United Methodist Church, and again, I believe, of all faith groups. This also provides a clear picture of advancing profits over safety, of advancing profits over the welfare of vulnerable children, of advancing profits over justice. And the United Methodist Church, while advocating for children to not be housed with adult inmates, was profiting from this at the exact same time. Again, this is a sickening picture. While we know that not every privately run prison is run like Walnut Grove, profiting from stock in CCA and GEO Group is a betrayal of all that we stand for as United Methodists and as followers of Jesus. So we must ask why the work of private prison companies and the mission of the United Methodist Church are so opposed to one another. And so we must look at biblical justice. So if you haven't gone to church this week, you're fixing to get a little bit. So justice is achieved in Scripture through creating avenues for fair and equal access to justice for those who are marginalized or are wrongfully accused. Justice was intended to hold those responsible for committing crimes to those they directly offended, and then also to fully restore them back to society. Justice was intended to bring healing to victims of crime, as well as the society as a whole. Rather than creating a system of retribution, God's justice and God's love are not at odds with one another. Words best used to describe God's justice being realized here on earth are not words like retribution and revenge, although those are so often used. Better words include accountability, restoration, and even reconciliation. God does not intend to love one part of the world and smite the other. God intends justice to be a healing balm for all of society. But justice, like all things, can and has been used as a means of detachment and of hoarding on to wealth and power for the few. The prophets Amos and Isaiah specifically point out that in utilizing the justice system as a means to secure wealth and power only for the affluent, while maintaining the poor and marginalized as a perpetual underclass, is in direct opposition to God's biblical intentions for justice. As many are today, Jesus himself was wrongly accused and convicted. He was abused by his captors while in custody and put to death even though he was innocent. Jesus' death was the result of a collusion between religious and affluent political leaders who wanted to maintain societal control, who feared the subversive movement that Jesus had started. The same collusion that existed then between wealth and power unfortunately exists today. In 2010 alone, CCA and GEO Group took in $2.9 billion. These profits depend on maintaining record levels of incarceration, not for healing for our society. This is supported by the recent letter CCA sent to the governors of 48 states, requesting an agreement between the state and CCA that if they acquire public prisons, then states would be required to keep those institutions over 90% full for at least 20 years. The profits made from incarcerating massive numbers of people is one major contributor to an explosion in the prison population that is simply out of control. And as David Shapiro writes in a study, this does not necessarily lead to public safety. But it does lead to enormous profits. And that seems to be the bottom line. Although alternatives to lengthy sentences would not lessen public safety and would save taxpayers money, private prisons create the situation where too many people make too much money to try these alternatives to incarceration. To secure those profits, private prison companies often hire lobbyists and make large campaign donations to ensure that incarceration rates continue to rise. Now, Tracy Velazquez of Justice Policy Institute will cover this more in detail, but suffice to say, the collusion of corporate profits from locking up huge numbers of people, particularly people of color, with securing political favor through campaign donations and extensive lobbying has made private prisons big business and the welfare of those who are incarcerated and their families expendable. This is not just immoral. This is inhumane. And to remind you, the United Methodist Church, all the while, was profiting from this collusion. But we were determined to end the collusion. That'd be a good cliffhanger. I probably should. We decided that in addition to the high-level conversations between leaders in the church, we wanted to alert United Methodists about our profiteering from private prisons and provide a means of making their voices heard. We started a petition calling for immediate divestment of stocks in CCA and GEO Group. The response by United Methodists was quick and intense. United Methodists were outraged because they knew that private prison corporations represent values that are antithetical to the values of compassion and justice that Jesus lived and taught and commands his followers to do the same. They were outraged because they knew that the work that they are passionate about, to care for those directly impacted by a broken criminal justice system, was being directly contradicted by our profiting from stock in private prison corporations. Though the response by church members has been powerful, I know how slow a large institutional bureaucracy works. Some of you are in touch with that emotion. And I was afraid it would take years to achieve divestment. Religious collusion with destructive forces is a horrible thing to openly confess, and even more difficult to break. So in spite of all the petition signers, the large number of emails flying back and forth, and the seemingly endless number of conversations, I was still stunned to learn at the beginning of this year that the United Methodist Board of Pensions, the board that controls the investments for the United Methodist Church, decided not only to divest from CCA and GEO Group entirely, but to permanently put into place a screen that will not allow us to invest into any corporation in the future that has gross revenues of 10% or more from private prisons. So we're free. What I've heard from the many United Methodists celebrating this move is that our joy emanates from the realization that once again we can say that what we believe in, that healing and restoration for those impacted by a broken criminal justice system, what we believe in is actually what we do. Imagine that. Just from this victory, I sense already a renewed passion among United Methodists to end mass incarceration and to make the U.S. criminal justice system truly just and fair. Our focus is to build movements among United Methodists to end mass incarceration. The language in our official policy as the United Methodist Church is to create a genuinely new system of justice because we know that the one that we have does not work. We advocate and work for a system that brings healing to victims of crime and to restore those who have committed crime to their families and communities. We want fairness. We want justice. We want justice that brings healing to our land. And a major step towards that reality of healing is to ensure that incarceration ceases to be a money-making affair for corporations like CCA and GEO Group. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for that inspiring story. May it inspire many others to follow the example of the United Methodists. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge my colleague, Margaret Winter, who unfortunately is not able to be with us today. But Margaret is currently litigating a case against the Walnut Grove Correctional Facility, working to redress the horrific conditions that Bill described. At this point, we have a welcome addition to our agenda. Representative Bobby Scott is unfortunately not able to be here, but Bobby Vassar is and has kindly offered to make some remarks.
Thank you, David. Just wanted to say on behalf of Congressman Scott, who is your host for the room for this event, that he welcomes you here and regrets that he's not able to be here with you this afternoon. He's very interested in this subject and is having it taped so that he will still be able to get the benefit of the information, and the tape will be posted on his website by his able assistant once we've completed here. And so just wanted to let you know that, and we're very interested to see this discussion here today, and it is something that we will certainly want to continue to work with you on. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Joshua Miller is a labor economist at the national headquarters of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, where he has worked for approximately 18 years. During that time, he's worked on numerous collective bargaining issues and has specialized in the area of corrections. Before joining AFSCME, Mr. Miller was a management consultant with Booz Allen Hamilton, where he worked on transportation, environmental, and energy issues. Mr. Miller has a BA in economics from Howard University and an MBA in finance from Johns Hopkins University. Joshua Miller.
Good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. I don't know how you follow up such an inspiring presentation by Bill there. I'm with AFSCME. AFSCME stands for the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. And AFSCME is a labor union which represents over 85,000 corrections employees. So we know a little bit about running prisons from the inside out. We represent the folks that deliver everything from the medical care for inmates to food service, provide the programming to help curb recidivism, provide for protecting public safety, and just about everything that you can think of that goes on inside a correctional facility. Once a facility is built, labor comprises about 70% of the operating costs, and as such, the private prison model is based on reducing labor costs. Everything from the siting of a facility to the procedures and everything that transpires within a facility is basically geared towards reducing labor costs. When you look at the model, one of the primary ways that costs are reduced, and Bill talked about this with Walnut, is by paying less. And national studies indicate that, on average, public sector correctional officers make about 30% more than private prison guards, which is pretty significant, particularly if you think about where prisons are built. They're typically built in rural areas. A lot of times they're clustered, so you have situations where you have private facilities and publicly run facilities in the same locality, and they're both pulling from the same labor pool. And if you have public facilities paying considerably more, that means that the private facilities tend to be hiring folks from the bottom of the barrel. The other thing that the low pay leads to is high turnover, and that's something else Bill talked about. And on average, we've seen national studies have indicated that turnover in privately operated prisons is about 52%, which is very high, as you can imagine. One of the handouts that I put outside is a back-to-back handout. On one side, there's a news story about a $6.5 million settlement against the GEO Group. Well, on the other side, I have a chart of turnover at a GEO-run facility in Oklahoma called the Lawton Correctional Facility, which is a facility where this abuse took place that led to the settlement. And I don't know whether folks grabbed this handout or not, but if you look at the CO correctional officer turnover at this facility, nationally that's at 52%. From fiscal year 06 to fiscal year 11, it went from 58% to 53%, being as high as 69% in 1 year. The reason why turnover is so serious in corrections is because corrections is not like tree trimming or some other public services that are out here. Corrections is an inherently dangerous profession. What tends to happen when you have high turnover is you have a workforce that essentially is a transient workforce. They don't see corrections as a profession. They're just there until they can find a better job. And essentially, what happens when you work in a correctional facility is one of the ways that you maintain control is through your interpersonal relationships with inmates. Because a lot of times, you're in a situation where you don't have a weapon, you're outnumbered 50 or 60 to 1, and your ability to be able to develop relationships with inmates is a way that you maintain control. It's also a way that you find out about gang activity. It's invaluable experience. The longer you're there, the more you can find out what's going on, the greater propensity there is for you to gain respect from inmates, so forth and so on. I've talked to inmates and they have told me that they know when folks are new, and those are the folks that are more than likely going to be tested. What we see in the private prison model is what we call a green workforce. And a green workforce is one where you have the constant turnover, so forth and so on. What this also leads to is less training, because if you have high turnover, a lot of times what happens is that will lead to chronic understaffing. And if you're constantly understaffed because there's a whole lot of turnover and you're pressed to fill those positions, you don't have time to train folks. So not only do you have a situation where you have high turnover and inexperienced staff, you have a high vacancy, you have understaffing, but then the folks that are on the job are folks that aren't trained properly. So as you can imagine, this is a recipe for disaster. And we see this play out in a much greater propensity for violence and all the terrible things that can happen in a correctional facility. We see a much greater propensity in privately run facilities. And also, as Bill alluded to, all of this is something that is preventable, but it's something that is part of the modus operandi of these companies. So it's part of their business practice. It's the way that they make money. So even though it's preventable, it's not something that they're going to change because they need to operate this way to make their margins. Another thing I'd like to say as well is that while frontline staff is paid less, and that's with most of the pressures to reduce costs, the same doesn't extend to corporate executives that work for private prisons. They tend to make 5 or 6 times as much as they did when they worked in the public sector. So we see sort of what I term as a reverse Robin Hood, where you see money being taken from the frontline staff and funneled to corporate executives, consultants, a whole industry that is based on just perpetuating the growth of what people call the prison industrial complex. And I've gone to conferences at the meetings at the American Correctional Association and other meetings where you see it's like an orgy for folks that want to make money off this industry. And these are the folks that are responsible for auditing private facilities and keeping track of the industry. So it's almost like the old saying, Dracula guarding the blood bank. There's no accountability when it comes to these private facilities. But the cutting of costs when it comes to staffing is particularly disturbing because the staff is, I mean, that's the lifeblood of who controls the facility, who runs the facility. Actually, the inmates control the facility, but the staff, as I mentioned, through the interpersonal relationships, so forth and so on, can hopefully maintain peace within the facility and prevent crazy things from happening, escapes and all the terrible things that can happen. We don't hear about these things typically until there's an escape or something heinous happens, or there's a lawsuit like the one that I mentioned. But there's a large propensity for it to happen because there are facilities like this run all over the country, in Puerto Rico and all around the world, even in other countries. If you knew the number of horror stories that are in the daily clips every single day about private prisons, and they're all related to staffing issues, essentially, all types of abuse and things of that nature, inability to stop cellmates from strangling each other and things of that nature because folks don't have the proper training, there's understaffing and things of that nature. It makes you realize how essential it is. So it's important to recognize that this model is flawed. It's a recipe for disaster, as I said, and it's something that can't be tolerated anymore. And I'd like to end with that.
Thank you, Joshua, for those remarks and for bringing to this discussion the perspective of those on the front lines every day. Both Bill and Joshua have referred to handouts, and you'll find on the table outside a wealth of information about the private prison industry. I think reports and other documents from, I think, all of the organizations represented on this panel. So please don't go now, but at the end, on your way out, please do help yourself to the literature on the table outside. David Shapiro is a staff attorney at the ACLU National Prison Project, where his litigation and advocacy work focuses on immigration detention, the First Amendment rights of incarcerated persons, public access to information about prisons, and the for-profit prison industry. Prior to joining the ACLU, David worked as a First Amendment lawyer at Davis Wright Tremaine and clerked for Judge Edward R. Becker on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. He is a graduate of Harvard College and Yale Law School and studied as a Fulbright scholar in Moscow. He is the author of several publications, including, most relevant for us today, Banking on Bondage, Private Prisons, and Mass Incarceration. David Shapiro.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, David. I'd like to focus principally on private prisons from the standpoint of human rights and decent conditions, which is what my colleagues at the ACLU National Prison Project focus on every day through litigation and other advocacy. Decent conditions and human rights in prison aren't about turning prisons into hotels. They're about making sure that people are treated fairly and decently so that they have the opportunity to rehabilitate themselves and upon release can reintegrate into society rather than being driven toward future crime. And from the standpoint of decent conditions and human rights, the history of for-profit incarceration is largely a history of failure. In 18th century England, private keepers, as they were called, often ran local jails. Now, they made plenty of money selling alcohol and other luxuries to rich prisoners in the jails, but poor prisoners who couldn't pay were exposed to horrifying deprivations. Indeed, as one historian writes, detainees in these facilities were gouged for fees, cheated on their provisions, loaded with irons, and exposed to disease. America's major experiment in for-profit incarceration came in the form of the convict lease system in the years after the Civil War. African Americans in the South may have been liberated from slavery, but many were jailed arbitrarily and rented out to private contractors who had little incentive to keep them alive. according to Professor Michelle Alexander, death rates were shockingly high, for the private contractors had no interest in the health and well-being of their laborers, unlike the earlier slave owners who needed their slaves, at minimum, to be healthy enough to survive hard labor. Now, today's private prisons may not look like a convict lease system, they may not look like an 18th century lockup, but what remains similar is the incentive structure. Private prisons have incentives to maximize profits by cutting corners, even at the expense of decent conditions. And Joshua Miller went into detail eloquently about how the evidence shows that private prisons may pay their correctional officers less than their public counterparts, resulting in higher rates of turnover and less experienced staff. Several studies also suggest that prisoners in private facilities may face greater threats to safety than those in governmentally operated prisons. While the evidence is somewhat mixed, one study concluded that the private sector is a more dangerous place to be incarcerated, and reported, based upon an analysis of national data, that the private sector experienced more than twice the number of assaults against inmates than did the public sector, more than twice the number. Similarly, a United States Department of Justice study, which was based on a national survey of prisons, reported that the privately operated facilities have a much higher rate of inmate on inmate and inmate on staff assaults and other disturbances than publicly operated facilities when institutions of similar security levels are compared. Another study reported the survey data presented in this paper show that privately operated prisons had much higher escape rates from secure institutions and much higher random drug hit rates than the Bureau of Prisons. And to cite one recent example of the dangers of private prisons, in 2010 there was a horrific escape from the Kingman facility, which is a private prison in Arizona. During this escape, the escapees are charged while on the run with murdering an elderly couple that was vacationing in New Mexico and burning down their camper. And after this occurred, the Arizona Department of Corrections sends auditors into the facility to find out what went wrong. The auditors reported that at the facility, staff are fairly green across all shifts, are not proficient with weapons, and habitually ignore sounding alarms. There are a number of ACLU cases, recent ones, that speak volumes about conditions in private prisons. In October of last year, the ACLU of Texas sued Corrections Corporation of America, the largest private prison operator in the United States, after a CCA employee sexually abused multiple immigration detainees. He was responsible for transporting detainees from the facility when they were released to the bus station or the airport. And no one in their right mind would send out a single unsupervised male officer in a van with female immigration detainees. But that's precisely what happened, and the predictable result was multiple instances of sexual abuse. One of the victims alleged what happened to her as follows. After about 20 minutes, the driver stopped again. It was very dark, and the road was deserted. I knew something wasn't right. He turned the car off. He started yelling for me to look at him, and finally I looked sideways and saw that he was touching himself, and he was grabbing me, wanting me to touch him. I was leaning away with my seatbelt on, pushing into the door and crying. The doors were locked. There were no cars on the road, and there was nothing I could do. I just shut up. I was crying, and he talked to me as if I were nothing. I thought he was going to kill me. My office, in conjunction with the Southern Poverty Law Center, is currently involved in litigation against the Walnut Grove Correctional Facility, which Bill and David have both mentioned. This is a private youth facility in Mississippi that's operated by the GEO Group. And to expand on some of the allegations in that case, I'll quote from some of the allegations in the complaint, which was filed in November of 2010. The youth imprisoned at Walnut Grove live in barbaric, unconstitutional conditions. Some prison staff exploit youth by selling drugs inside the facility. Other staff members abuse their power by engaging in sexual relationships with the youth in their care. Many youth have suffered physical injuries, some serious and some permanent, as a result of dangerously deficient security policies and prison staff who are physically abusing the young men housed in the facility. Youth who are handcuffed and defenseless have been kicked, punched and beaten all over their bodies. For the sole purpose of inflicting excruciating pain, some staff have sprayed dangerous chemical restraints on young men who are secure in their cells. Some youth are stripped naked and held in isolation for weeks at a time. The ACLU recently settled another case against a private prison, the Idaho Correctional Center, which is run by Corrections Corporation of America. Levels of violence at this facility had become so extreme that it was dubbed the Gladiator School. And in video that was obtained by the Associated Press, an inmate mercilessly beats another inmate while private prison guards reportedly failed to intervene. Here's what a prisoner at that facility wrote in a letter to the ACLU about the medical care he received after being attacked. "I was treated horribly, like it was my fault. I was then taken to the hole, stripped to my underwear, and left. I was shaking and cold. I was bleeding, and I kept going in and out of consciousness. I had a concussion with loss of balance and headache. Many, many hours later, I was given my clothes and a blanket. The ice was all the medical treatment that I had." Human rights abuses in private prisons are exacerbated by a basic lack of accountability. Almost everything that happens in a prison happens behind closed doors and is not accessible to the public. And one of the few tools that the public and the media have for finding out what goes on behind the closed doors of a federal prison or immigration detention facility is the Federal Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. But due to a loophole in the law, the FOIA does not apply to private prison companies that contract with the federal government. So even though a BOP or ICE-operated facility is performing the exact same functions as a contract facility that has a contract with BOP or ICE, there's a gap in the accountability to the public between these two essentially identical institutions. Federal prisoners in private facilities also have fewer means to hold their jailers accountable for violations of constitutional rights. It's well established that prisoners in a public institution can bring suit for monetary damages when they're deprived of constitutional rights in ways such as being exposed to brutal beatings or being given woefully inadequate medical care that results in preventable death. But the Supreme Court's recent decision in Minitry versus Pollard greatly restricts the ability of prisoners in for-profit facilities to sue for monetary damages for violations of their constitutional rights. As David Fathi said, roughly 16% of federal prisoners are in private institutions, and nearly half of immigration detainees are in such facilities. And in essence, the recent decision leaves these prisoners and detainees with fewer constitutional rights than their counterparts in publicly operated facilities. Private facilities also are not subjected to adequate governmental oversight, and state and federal government entities have failed to hold private contractors accountable for their actions. For example, in 2003, the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division found that the Santa Fe Adult Correctional Detention Center, through Physicians Network Associates, the medical contractor, quote, provides inadequate medical services in the following areas: intake, screening, and referral, acute care, emergent care, chronic and prenatal care, and medication administration and management. As a result, inmates of the detention center with serious medical needs are at risk for harm. The letter from the Justice Department Civil Rights Division further explained that an inmate was not offered treatment for a contagious tuberculosis infection. Despite these findings, and these are findings of the Justice Department, of which BOP is a part, despite those findings, BOP still houses prisoners at the Reeves County Detention Center, a private prison in Texas where the same entity, the PNA, provides medical care. And the history of medical neglect may have repeated itself at Reeves. As court papers and news reports assert, Jesus Manuel Galindo, a Reeves prisoner, was an epileptic and thus in need of regular medical care and attention. But his body allegedly was not found until after rigor mortis had set in, indicating, of course, that prison officials did not discover his death for some time. According to the complaint filed in the lawsuit, Galindo died of an epileptic seizure while in solitary confinement, left in a cell with a broken intercom that prevented him from calling for help. According to a neurologist who reviewed Galindo's autopsy, he was set up to die. In another striking failure of oversight, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, literally lost track of 10 deaths that occurred in immigration detention facilities, and 2 of these were at a private facility in Arizona. It wasn't until Freedom of Information Act litigation by the ACLU obtained these documents that these deaths were even rediscovered or known. And one of the deaths was that of Felix Franklin Rodriguez Torres, who was forgotten by the government until his name emerged in documents obtained through this litigation. Once the death was exposed, New York Times reporter Nina Bernstein reconstructed the tragic story as follows. By the time the alien detainee was taken to the emergency room at Maricopa Medical Center in Phoenix, he had a mass on his neck that had tripled in size and obstructed his breathing, according to a government accounting form summarizing his care. Too far gone for chemotherapy, he was placed on life support, and he died when it was disconnected. Now, proponents of privatization often tout supposed cost savings associated with private prisons. The evidence, however, is mixed at best, and several studies have found no evidence of significant cost savings. On the federal level, in 2007, the Government Accountability Office reported that the Bureau of Prisons failed to collect adequate data to determine whether private federal prisons were more or less expensive than publicly operated ones. In 2010, the Arizona Auditor General stated, based upon an analysis by the Arizona Department of Corrections, that it may be more costly to house inmates in private prisons than in public institutions. Similarly, a sweeping meta-analysis of previous privatization studies found that cost savings from privatization are not guaranteed and the quality of services is not improved. Across the board, effect sizes were small, so small that the value of moving to a privately managed system is questionable. And supporters of privatization also claim that new private prisons will lead to economic growth. And this is a particularly alluring argument at a time when many communities are struggling and looking for ways to expand growth and employment. The evidence, however, suggests that building prisons does not provide economic gain. In fact, a 2010 study by researchers at Washington State University and Ohio State University examined all data on new and existing prisons in the United States since 1960 and stated that their findings cast doubt on claims that prison building is worth the investment for struggling rural communities. And a case in point is the town of Hardin, Montana. To finance a jail, the town had an economic development authority that issued $27 million worth of municipal bonds that were both uninsured and unrated. But once the facility opened, it was unable to obtain a contract to obtain any inmates to fill its 464 beds. The facility remained empty. And because it remained empty, the $27 million in bonds that were issued to finance it lacked sufficient revenue to back them. So the authority defaulted on the bonds. Roughly 67 people had cleared background checks and been hired to work in the new prison, but they couldn't report to work because it remained empty. And just preventing the empty building from falling apart began to be a significant economic burden for the town. Pipes began to leak in 2009. More leaks were discovered in 2010, and repairs were slated to cost $8,000. That was on top of the gas bills. In the winter, the gas bills can run as much as $10,000 per month for an empty building. So the town turned toward increasingly desperate measures to fill the jail. When President Obama pledged to remove all detainees from Guantanamo Bay, the Hardin City Council voted unanimously to receive the Guantanamo detainees in Montana. Proposal that didn't materialize. And other ideas for what to do with the empty jail included using it as an enormous indoor greenhouse for medical marijuana, a fight site for paintball, or as low-income housing. And, in early 2011, the makers of the show Deadliest Catch, about rival crab fishermen in Alaska vying to get lots of really good crab, were interested in making a reality show about prisons, and so they were exploring using that facility for the show. But they had the same problem. They would first have to get prisoners to actually be in the facility before they could do a reality show. So in short, the bottom line is that private prisons have little to offer. Not only do they present a threat to human rights, but claims of cost savings and economic benefit appear greatly overstated. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Tracy Velazquez is Executive Director of the Justice Policy Institute, a position she's held since January 2009. Under her direction, JPI has reinforced its reputation for cutting-edge reports on both adult and juvenile justice, become a leader in the use of social media for justice reform movement building, and been recognized as one of the most trusted organizations for analysis of state and local policy issues. Tracy came to JPI from the Vera Institute of Justice, where she worked on adult sentencing and corrections and authored the report, Pursuit of Safety. Prior to moving into the justice field, Tracy led the Montana Mental Health Association and worked on a variety of social justice and public health issues. She has a bachelor's degree from Harvard University and a master's in public administration from Montana State University. Tracy Velazquez.
I appreciate you telling the story about Hardin. Having lived in Montana, it's about a 1.5 degree of separation, so I knew some of the players involved in that fiasco. So I just wanted to say thank you again for inviting me and to come and talk with you about private prisons. Dismantling private prisons must become a top priority for this country. Given the level of power that corporations have right now, we will not end mass incarceration in the United States while there are those who profit by it. And there's no question that the private prison industry is profiting. Revenues are on the rise at the nation's two largest private prison companies, with the Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, increasing their annual revenue $60 million over last year's to $1.7 billion, and GEO Group's income increasing from $1.3 billion in 2010 to $1.6 billion in 2011. This puts their combined income for 2011 at $3.3 billion. Their combined net profits increased over 9% last year to just under $240 million in profit. Last year, the Justice Policy Institute released our report, Gaming the System, which we have some outside, which showed how private prison companies are using their money and political clout to boost their bottom line. While they may have you believe that they are only interested in market share, that is, moving people from public to private facilities, this is really only part of the story. For decades, they have been behind some of the most harmful criminal justice policies that have filled our prisons to overflowing and created the demand for the quick fix of private prisons. Since the 80s, CCA, really since the very beginning of private prisons, CCA and the GEO Group have been active in the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, a group that advances free market principles. They have been leaders on the Public Safety Task Force of ALEC, which crafted many of the pieces of punitive model legislation that have come across state legislatures around the country over the past 2 decades. This includes mandatory minimum sentences for a growing variety of offenses, 3 strikes laws that require people to serve long terms, often 25 years to life, for a repeat offense, and truth in sentencing, which denies people the opportunity to be released under parole and cuts back on the amount of good time that people can earn while incarcerated. These sentences are a big reason why today the U.S. is the world's leading jailer. Although both CCA and GEO claim that they are no longer active in ALEC, the damage has been done. In the past quarter century, the U.S. prison population in state and federal prisons increased from about 400,000 in 1982 to over 1.6 million in 2010. As states sought ways to accommodate this massive increase, CCA and GEO stepped in with the solution, private prisons. By 2010, over 128,000 people were housed in private prisons in the United States. How has the private prison industry been able to get these laws passed? In part, they have relied on friendly politicians who want to look tough on crime. But they have also paid to play, giving money to politicians and parties who are willing to push through these type of policies. The private prison industry, mostly made up of GEO and CCA, but also including some smaller companies, has contributed over $3.8 million to state candidates and political parties since 2007. Giving was primarily directed toward incumbents and to parties who can influence their entire delegations. Much of this money was spent in states that were looking to pass policies that would increase incarceration or shift toward private prisons. In Arizona, the private prison industry and ALEC drafted and helped push through Senate Bill 1070, which gave police the power to question and detain anyone who could not prove that they were in the country legally. Clearly, the new law would likely increase the use of private prisons, private facilities, both for incarceration and for a rapidly expanding use of immigration detention. GEO and CCA spent over $1.5 million in political contributions in Arizona in 2010 to 2011, including funds for SB 1070 sponsors. In Florida, I had the opportunity to go down with David Shapiro a couple of weeks ago to talk about the fight there against privatizing prisons. In 2010, private prison industry gave nearly $1 million to people's campaigns in their attempt to privatize prisons. We're hopeful that the latest attempt is going to fail. It failed narrowly in the Senate. Session's not over, but we're optimistic that it's dead. But you can be sure that they're going to be back. At the federal level, CCA and GEO's PACs have spent over $1.4 million on federal elections in 2008, 2010, and the current election cycles to date, with a little over half going to Republicans. We are seeing actually a shift more towards Democrats over the past several years. It was originally about 3/4 and then 2/3, and now it's almost half, going to Democrats now over Republicans. While states are still battling to balance their budgets, which they are mandated to do, they are looking to cut their prison populations so they can fund other vital services. And we know the best way to reduce the cost of prisons is to reduce the number of people going to prison. It's not shortchanging the services for people in prison. If we can cut the number of people going to prison, that's the best way to reserve funds for the more important things, the more necessary things, the more positive things that we want to do in society. However, federal lawmakers have not gotten the memo. They don't need to balance their budget, do they? And so what we have seen is a continued increasing budget for the Bureau of Prisons. The same thing with the number of people who are incarcerated. We know that state prison populations are down. The federal population continues to rise. And as was mentioned, harsh immigration policies and policing is also causing detention numbers to skyrocket. Since 1996, the number of people detained annually has grown from 70,000 to more than 380,000 in 2009. And as was mentioned, almost half of the 32,000 people in detention facilities in 2009 were housed in privately operated detention facilities. In addition to the outright donations to influence their favorite politicians, private prison companies have also nurtured cozy relationships with lawmakers and administrators, spending millions on lobbying for policies that will lock more people up. In the past 2 years, CCA spent over $2 million on federal lobbying, while GEO Group spent another $880,000. So what bills were they trying to influence, you may ask? Well, one was a bill that would close the loophole that David mentioned, where private prisons don't need to make the same information available as public facilities do to the public. This bill failed. They also lobbied on bills related to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and they also lobbied on appropriations bills for both the Bureau of Prisons, the Federal Detention Trustee, and ICE. As the CCA financial reports for 2011 demonstrate, this was money well spent. Their federal revenue increased 5.9% in the final quarter of 2011 as compared with the similar period, the same period for the year before. CCA stated that much of the increase in federal revenue resulted from higher populations from the U.S. Marshal Service. The current director of the Marshal Service came to her job directly from a lucrative consulting gig with a private prison. While lobbying at the state level can be difficult to analyze because of different laws each state has around disclosure, the National Institute on Money and State Politics found that CCA employed 266 lobbyists from 2003 to 2011, while GEO Group and their subsidiaries employed another 120. Those on the ground fighting private prison bills will tell you that when those bills are up for discussion, these lobbyists are everywhere, both publicly in the halls and behind closed doors at private dinners that they fund. I want to stress again that the private prison industry is well aware of the possible impact of criminal justice reforms that could reduce mass incarceration. The following is a quote from the CCA 2010 annual report. This is a direct quote. The demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by the relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency in conviction or parole standards and sentencing practices, or through the decriminalization of certain activities that are currently prescribed by our criminal laws. For instance, any changes with respect to drugs and controlled substances or illegal immigration could affect the number of persons arrested, convicted, and sentenced, thereby potentially reducing demand for correctional facilities to house them. Legislation has been proposed in numerous jurisdictions that could lower minimum sentences for some nonviolent crimes and make more inmates eligible for early release based on good behavior. Also, sentencing alternatives under consideration could put some offenders on probation with electronic monitoring who would otherwise be incarcerated. Similarly, reductions in crime rates or resources dedicated to prevent and enforce crime could lead to reductions in arrests, convictions, and sentences requiring incarceration at correctional facilities." End quote. Make no mistake, the private prison industry will continue to work to create profits for their shareholders, whether it means moving people from public to private prisons, increasing the number of people detained, or fighting reforms that will reduce incarceration. Just this week, CCA sent a letter to 48 states saying that they had earmarked $250 million to buy public facilities on the condition that they would remain 90% full for 20 years. This would effectively destroy the financial incentives to reduce the overall prison population and be a constant drain on taxpayer dollars, as states would be paying even if the beds were empty. In cases where public officials are pursuing reforms that are decreasing incarceration, private prisons are fighting back. In Liberty County, Texas, for example, local officials have been effectively using alternatives to pretrial detention to help bring down the number of people in the privately run jail. The private facility's response raised the per diem cost. As the judge there stated, quote, "One bid said that if the inmate population goes below 200, the cost per inmate goes from $63 to $68 per day. If we work really hard to decrease the inmate population, the cost will go up to $70 a day. They are taking all the incentive out of it." Even those outside the justice reform world are beginning to take notice. Just yesterday, an investment website columnist noted that CCA's offer to buy prisons if states keep them full might distort policymaking and sentencing decisions. Quote, "The crime rate is, after all, on the decline. The contracts may make judges feel obligated to dole out longer sentences or seek out more petty criminals just to fill cells. This is especially interesting in the case of marijuana, which is on an arguably slow but steady track to become legalized. Regardless of where one might stand on the issue of marijuana legalization, it reasons that guaranteed contracts between private prisons and states may not foster a fair consideration of the issue in the courts." Today we have heard many reasons why private prisons have no place in this country. As important as any reason is that given the harms that mass incarceration causes to people, to communities, and to the country as a whole, no one should profit more when more people are imprisoned. And more people locked up is exactly what private prison companies want. As long as there is a profit motive, there will be the corrupting influence of campaign donations, the triangle of influence peddling as people at the state and federal level rotate between working for government and lobbying government, and the myriad of ways that this industry will seek to thwart efforts to end this shameful era in U.S. history, this incarceration generation. We look forward to a time when our children and our children's children say, why did we ever think it was okay to allow people to make money, locking other people up? Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy, and thanks to all our expert panelists. And now we'd like to hear from all of you. If you would like to direct your comment or question to a specific panelist, please do so. Otherwise, we will throw it open. Yes.
Yes, thank you. I'm Nikichi Taifa with the Open Society. I first want to just say to the ACLU, thank you for your work for such a long time. So I know way back when I was working with the ACLU, we were beginning to look at this issue. I have a couple of questions. Good, Bobby, I'm glad you're still here, too. I have a couple of questions for a couple of different people, if that's okay. But Bobby, are you contemplating any federal legislation, or is there anything already on the horizon? That's number one. Number two, this is for anybody on the panel, maybe Tracy or anybody. I've heard criticisms that advocacy around private prisons is misplaced because the private prisons represent a small portion of the corrections, or whatever. So I want you to respond to that so I can have a good argument against that. And Bill, I want to know, do you know if the United Methodist Church is the first institution, first major institution to come out with respect to divestment? And then, one last thing. Great, yeah. I also want to know, does or would or could your advocacy also extend to sentencing reform in general, like against mandatory minimums and things along those lines? I hate to do this, but the final thing, I was saying that, okay. But does anyone know what happened to those two judges in, I think it was New Jersey or whatever, that were sending kids to private prisons and getting kickbacks and things? I know that was a lot, I'm sorry, but I'm very passionate about this issue. I'm glad you did.
That's
You all
great.
remember?
I think I remember the question, but if it's, do I contemplate any legislation affecting private prisons? Right now, the answer is no, but I ask you, do you have any proposals?
Okay. Well, hopefully, I presume after
Yes,
all
we
this.
can certainly discuss that. Anyone want to address any of the other questions?
When we did our report, I mean, that's one of the things we talked about was, well, it's not, it's a larger percentage of people in federal prisons and a much larger percentage of people in immigration detention than in state populations. But a couple of reasons I think it's just a critical issue. One is that it creates disincentives for reducing mass incarceration. I mean, if policymakers think that there's an easy way that they can, instead of dealing with sentencing reform, instead of dealing with making sure people get rehabilitation, they just figure, well, we'll just push them to some other facility, there's one always waiting, then that reduces the incentives to decrease the policies that lead to incarceration. I think it's also important just because of the message it sends from a human rights perspective, this idea of treating people as units of goods rather than as human beings, and we already see that there's such a dehumanizing of people who are incarcerated, and using them as basically a bottom line on a spreadsheet just makes that even worse.
Bill, are the United Methodists the first to divest?
As far as I know, I don't know of anybody else. Now, I think honestly, we've been told, or I've had discussions with other folks in other denominations who are just even looking into whether or not they're invested. I mean, it takes a lot of digging to find this out. So I know that others are looking in. Now, I would also say that others might have divested very quietly. I know that that was the preference by most of the folks within the United Methodist Church, and we instead wanted to go very public with it, because we wanted to make a public statement about if you're going to repent from something that you've been profiting from, it should be public, and it should hopefully then inspire and hopefully motivate others, and so to do the same. So we've encouraged not only other denominations, and we're talking with other folks, but we've encouraged United Methodists to look at their own retirement plans, their own investment holdings, and to divest personally as well. And we couldn't do that if we just did that quietly. So we made, against the objections of some people within the church, this is all right, we've made it very, very public. As public as we possibly can.
And Joshua might ask me expand its advocacy to include sentencing reform.
Well, let me say this first of all. I work for the national office in Washington, and AFSCME is decentralized, so what our affiliates around the country do kind of depends on the local situation. But we've had affiliates in places like Wisconsin and Connecticut that have advocated for sentencing reform and things of that nature, because our folks don't like overcrowding either. It makes their job harder. A lot of times what will happen is they'll flood prisons with inmates, but they won't hire staff. And that's dangerous for our folks. And our folks realize that. So they realize that the wise thing to do is to have the people that need to be in prison, in prison. So we have affiliates that have worked in that direction. But we don't have any kind of sort of national policy. We let the affiliates determine what they want to do. Also, I wanted to say in terms of divestment, there have been quite a few divestment campaigns over time. I worked with a student organization that got Sodexo Marriott to divest from CCA a number of years ago, and New York State divested from CCA when, I forget the controller's name, but he was an African American who was the controller of the state of New York. They divested from CCA as well. There have been other divestment campaigns as well.
What about the state of California? In California, the unions there, what are they doing about it?
CCPOA?
Yeah.
Well, CCPOA is a different union. We're not affiliated with them in any way, but I assume that, of course, as far as I know, they're fighting privatization. California is going through a realignment process right now where they're reducing their inmate population because of court orders and things of that nature. I don't know if you know more about that or not. I don't know if the ACLU has been involved with that at all, but they're slowly reducing their inmate population in the state of California. Recently canceled some contracts with private vendors just in that effort to reduce the number of folks in correctional facilities. And they also pulled folks out of a private facility in Michigan, which was a jail facility, which was part of that. So I don't know the exact numbers, but I know that California is mandated by a certain date to decrease their inmate population a certain amount, and they're on track to do that. In terms of what the union is doing out there, I can't speak for those folks, but as far as I know, they've been on the record in terms of fighting prison privatization.
Question over here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I have a comment and also a question. My name's Sam Goldberg. I organize with Occupy DC's Criminal Justice Committee, and actually we've been waging a campaign against the private prison industry. In particular, Wells Fargo invests very heavily in private prisons, and both GEO Group and CCA do some of their banking with Wells Fargo. So we've been trying to get people to withdraw their money. So anybody who is who has their money with Wells Fargo should take it out. And so thanks to Mr. Mefford for doing the same thing at United Methodist Church. And then my other question actually is related to a term Mr. Miller used, which was the prison industrial complex, which actually has been a term that's been used prior to the proliferation of the private prison industry. And one of the reasons it's been used is because there are a number of corporations outside of private prisons that benefit off mass incarceration. So, you know, the contractors who build the prisons, the people who provide the food, certainly the telecommunication companies that just overcharge inmates for calling their loved ones, and apologies, but frankly, Mr. Miller's organization as well. And so I wonder if there are any efforts to combat that, and what's going on around. Obviously this is sort of the worst and most direct profit off prisons, but is there any fight against these other industries that also make money off prisons?
I can say a couple of comments. One is, besides Wells Fargo, another divestment campaign a long time ago before they went out of business was against Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers was a organization who brokered a lot of the speculative prison building. They were often consultants on those deals, and they made a lot of money. I don't know if everybody knows what spec prisons are, but basically it's where you build a prison on speculation that you're going to get inmates from somewhere. The other thing I want to say too is regarding your point, if you ever go, I mentioned the American Correctional Association when I was talking, and if you ever go to one of their conferences, you will see exactly what the gentleman was talking about, where you have, everything that you can think about in a prison, from the low jacks to just everything. There's a lot of money being made off of incarceration. Our folks have jobs, they don't, and that's the way it is.
I would just like to comment on the telephone issue. I mean, that's a dirty deal, those telephones. And there's a lot of places, I live in Maryland, and we had a hearing on both the county and the state, how much the companies come in the public facilities, and then they get the state or the local jail they basically split the profits, and you've got the lowest income people paying these taxes of 50% to use a telephone because of these telephones. And it's worse in the private prisons, because one of the ways that they're trying to say we're going to save you money at the state level, then they gouge the families of the people who are in these private prisons with the commissaries and the telephones. And there's very little that we can even find out about how much they're gouging people in those private prisons, because there's just so little accountability. But, yes.
Yes.
Actually, I'm here with the St. Louis Proctor Conference and Covenant Baptist United Church of Christ. My name is Reverend Kelly Welkins. I'm here in Washington, D.C. and Southeast. And my question is more local as it pertains to Washington, D.C. We don't have a prison here anymore, and our residents are sent to 44 different states. But there were private prisons built to profit off of Norton being closed. And specifically, I work with men and women returning home, and I hear so many stories, the ones that would even talk about it, but particularly medical issues and never being addressed, and they come home with needing hip replacement, knee, whatever the case may be, but they're not being tended to in terms of medical or any specific things that need to be taken care of. So my issue is that Congress instituted that there be oversight for our residents, and specifically there has not been since for 15 years. And you're supposed to have a council that does that. There has not been any oversight. And so I even asked the Deputy Director of Justice here, how do you know what's going on with our residents? And he said, we don't know. And so we don't see them until they return home. And I believe because our tax dollars, whether you live in Maryland, D.C., Utah, pay for D.C. residents to be incarcerated. It should be a national issue that we have no clue what is going on with our residents or what's going on with the tax dollars. And they come home with no reintegration services, nothing, no education. How they left, they come back worse. And we're seeing that more and more every year. 2,500 people return home on supervision, but even more return home that are not on supervision. And we're having, major issues. Our community and families are exacerbated by what is going on here in the district.
Thank you. Panel, care to address that?
I'll make a couple of comments. One is, first of all, you have a private prison right here in D.C. D.C. was actually the first jurisdiction to ever take an existing facility with inmates in it and sell it to a private company. That's the D.C. treatment facility, was sold to Corrections Corporation of America. In terms of the other thing too, tying it back to TCA, is the Youngstown facility where they were shipping a lot of D.C. inmates, and you probably know the history of that and what came out of that. And unfortunately, in D.C., CCA tried to build a facility, I think it was in Southeast, or it might have been in PG County.
It was Southeast.
It was in Southeast. And you had folks, elected officials, that were pushing that, I think one was formerly on the D.C. Council, and I'm not quite sure if Marion Barry was involved or not, but fortunately, the residents rejected that, even though there was a lot of money that was put out there.
Yeah. So they just built it in Rivers Correctional Center. They just built it in North Carolina instead. Yeah.
Right. They built in North Carolina, and that is a problem. That's a problem that we find all over the country when you ship inmates to other states and things of that nature. This industry basically has a business model that is built on that, and that has helped to perpetuate that by building these speculative facilities and things of that nature. That's one issue. But one of the reasons why we argue against private prisons is because of speculative building and them perpetuating movement and the shipment of inmates all over the country, specifically for profit. But what you're talking about in terms of folks being shipped across the country is a problem regardless of what the facility is, because of issues with recidivism and things of that nature, because it's been basically shown that an inmate being able to see his or her family and have that interaction is one of the important things that helps to aid in curbing recidivism. And obviously when you ship a person to Arizona or whatever, it becomes a lot more difficult. So that is a problem, at least in terms of the private piece. It's something that we're definitely trying to shut down. I guess a little bit of good news is I think that because the inmate population has been going down, there's less of that kind of speculative prison building and a push to do that, but that doesn't solve your problem.
Sir, yes.
Yes, I just follow up on that question. Mel Wilson from National Association of Social Workers. Are there not national standards for private prisons around healthcare, mental health care, transitional services? That states and feds have at least some standards around that. Are we saying that there are no standards that they have to adhere?
I don't know if anybody else wants to address that, but I'll say one thing real quick. Remember the American Correctional Association that I talk about that has this big conference where you have all these vendors that make money and things of that nature?
I've seen it.
Right. The American Correctional Association also accredits facilities. And in these private prison contracts, the only accountability that you often have is that the facility is ACA accredited. Well, the private vendors pay for that accreditation, first of all. They advertise in all their publications. Sometimes they themselves act as auditors, and they attend the conferences. They pay for display booths. They make donations to ACA, so forth and so on. So there's very little accountability as far as ACA. In addition to that, the whole accreditation process is just looks at procedures. In other words, as long as they have a procedure for inmates to file a grievance, that gets checked off. There's no evaluation of what happens with that. There's no qualitative, no sort of outcome-driven assessment. And many of the facilities that have been ACA accredited are also facilities where there have been major riots, where there have been escapes, et cetera, and the accreditation is never taken away. So once you pay that money and you get that ACA stamp of approval, you're good. So
Correctional Health Association.
The Correctional Health Association right now is linked in with ACA.
That was my question.
Yeah, they're linked in with ACA as well. So the only, a lot of times, the only way that that things get brought up is an organization like the ACLU comes in and files a lawsuit. There's unconstitutional treatment, so forth and so on. That's brought to the light. That was brought to the light in places like California, where you had a judge come in and look over the system and things of that nature. But otherwise, if you just rely on the way the system is right now, it's not going to happen because there are too many economic incentives. And the book that JPI put out, Gaming the System, talks about that when they talk about the system that supports this whole industry. There's a whole network that supports this whole industry, and the whole accreditation and monitoring agencies, or organizations rather, are all tied into it. They're making money off of it as well. That's why I said it's like Dracula guarding the blood bank. It's not there.
And there are any number of cases where courts have found that an institution that's accredited by the ACA or by NCCHC is violating the Constitution.
Yes, in that third row.
My question actually follows up on that, because I'm interested in why standards don't make it into a contract between the BOP or ICE and the facility that they're contracting with. I mean, you could have a licensed plumber, and you still require them to follow building codes, right? So why wouldn't there be content to a contract that says we expect these kinds of standards to be followed? Which, if that were true, would probably price a lot of these places out of the market.
So you heard me say that the woman who's running the Marshal Service used to work for the GEO Group, right?
Right.
Okay. It just seems like.
I'm looking for where legislation could be, so maybe
Right.
that's.
I mean, there have been a few states that have done a better job of holding private facilities accountable. A lot of times, what happens is, they then find other, it's sort of like pressure on one side, so they find some other way to make money. Like where we've seen a lot of these sort of phone contracts go up in the commissaries. And the other thing we've seen is that they try to make money by holding people who are actually available for parole. They manage to hold them an extra two weeks, a month here, or people pass their end of sentence. But in terms of the federal government, we really see a lack of accountability by Congress of these facilities. And we've got, in terms of how much they're even paying per bed, it's hard to find out. Our belief is that the federal government is overpaying for these private beds right now as a sort of a kickback to these companies, and it's helping them actually come up with these, better deals for the state so they can capture the market. I mean, there's a lot of questions that I have about federal oversight right now and the lack thereof.
And these are very long-term contracts too. I mean, right, like Tracy was talking about the CCA proposal to buy facilities and enter into a contract for 20 years until 2032. It's very difficult to, even if you have the right people at any given time ensuring robust oversight, is it going to be the same people 20 years later? I think that's an issue.
Yeah, let me say something as well. One thing that Tracy mentioned was the legislation about disclosure. And that's one way, because a lot of times what happens is the private companies will say, well, this information is proprietary, so we don't have to let anybody know what's going on. When I talked about the turnover, 52% in private facilities versus 16% in publicly run facilities, that was information that was volunteered by the private vendors. So the discrepancies could even be higher, because there's no public accountability in terms of information. So we just have to go by what they tell us. A lot of times they're not going to give us information that's going to make them look bad. As a matter of fact, once we got this information, they stopped providing it because they found out it was being used against them. So I mean, that's one thing. The other thing too is, I mean, we have PREA now, Prison Rape Elimination Act. I guess we're waiting for that to be finalized, but that's another thing. David talked about a scenario where there was some sexual abuse. We found that there's a much higher propensity for sexual abuse in privately operated facilities. A lot of it has to do with the kind of staff that they hire, but the issue is they have to be held accountable with PREA. A lot of these contracts are very complex. A lot of times the BOP doesn't contract directly with a private company. What they do is they'll contract with a county, and the county will subcontract with a private company. And this is a way that they can get around a lot of different things. A lot of these contracts are 2-, 3-, and 4-tiered contracts. Sometimes states will contract with a county and not a private company, so they don't have to go out to competitive bid, because there's something in the law that says if they contract with a for-profit, they have to put it out to bid. If they send them to the county jail, they don't have to. So then the county just subcontracts. So private companies have figured out how to game the system, if I can use that.
Granted.
In New Jersey, there was something that came out recently where correctional education systems won a contract, and supposedly it's a contract that's not supposed to go to a for-profit, which they are. But what they've done is essentially created a nonprofit as a subsidiary, and they're just subcontracting it to themselves as a nonprofit. So what you have to understand is, as long as there's an incentive there to make money, they'll find a way to do it. And getting to Tracy's point, as long as there's an incentive in locking people up, you'll never stop locking people up.
Yes.
I'm Elena with Human Rights Watch. So it sounds like obviously the ideal would be to eliminate private prisons entirely, but in the meantime, or if that's not politically feasible, is it worth it to try to, increase the accountability, close that loophole so that FOIA does apply, ensure that PREA applies? I mean, is that feasible? Would that be worth the effort to try to push for that, if not,
That would be the first, I mean, that would probably the best single piece of legislation that we could pass right now would be accountability of making FOIA apply to private prisons.
Yeah, and it just doesn't make any sense to have different regime, applied to prisons that are doing the same thing. And I think that, not only would it be good for informational purposes, but it could set the groundwork for future legislation and more progress once we have a better sense of what's actually going on in these facilities.
Charlie. Well, let me say, I don't know if I'm going to say this right. Let me start off. Joshua, I have a lot of respect for you.
Appreciate that.
Let me say too, I've heard you many times. I think the anti-private prison movement is really the pro-union movement, which I support in many, many ways. But like Nikichi said and Pauline said, I wonder sometimes if the unions are always on our side. And that's not to say you. I've talked over the years. I went to Mr. Sweeney when he was director and said, we need you, etc. I've come to the conclusion that the unions are not run by people of color. In fact, there is no major union that I know of that is not run by a white male.
That may change soon, but okay.
Okay, but it hasn't. And that may be the reason. The only time, as Nikichi mentioned, other issues. The only time I've ever seen a union person was today at an issue. Now, maybe I'm missing a lot of meetings, but I go to a lot of meetings. We have a lot of meetings at an open society. The unions are not there. Have they signed on to PREA? Do they support PREA?
Well, let me tell you something.
Well, let me just finish one last thing, because I think Pauline and Nikichi covered broader issues. I'm saying bring this back.
Right.
We're going to be, as Tracy said, in a hell of a fight. I think that governors are going to come back through executive order. We're not out of the woods of that. And we have to be all together on this. And let me just ask one last thing. Is ban-the-box movement occurring within the unions? In the hiring of former prisoners, felons? I mean, we're seeing it around the whole country, cities, etc. I don't see it. Now, maybe I'm missing it. But are they hiring former prisoners, etc., in the unions? I don't think they are. Maybe they are, but we're not hearing about it if we should be hearing about it. But I'm just saying that I always question whether you're really on our side, whether the unions really want to expand the prisons like California, or they really just care about this issue and that's it. It's much broader than that, like Nikichi pointed out.
Joshua, are you really on our side?
Let me say this. AFSCME, not to toot a horn or anything like this, but AFSCME has a long history in the whole, civil rights struggle and things of that nature. As you may know, when Dr. King was assassinated, he was down supporting our
Prison reform, we're talking.
God before the strike, right?
Okay.
Now, in terms of prison privatization, we've worked with many coalitions, many groups who, have divergent views. For example, in Florida, I was just saying earlier, you had the Tea Party and the NAACP both on the same day come out against prison privatization. Who would have thought that the Tea Party and the NAACP would be on the same page on an issue? So coalitions make strange bedfellows. We don't necessarily have to agree on everything, but we have to agree on the issue that we came together on to fight against. That today is prison privatization. And in terms of prison privatization, we're willing to work with, any group that is opposed to prison privatization on that issue. In terms of other issues, I don't work on those issues. I'm not the right person to ask about those issues, but if you have a question about prison privatization, I can address that because that is the topic that we're talking about today.
So can I chime in here? And maybe I have to take my JPI hat off and put it on the table for just a minute. I'm not sure. But, I mean, one of the things that I think we need to bring to the table, which I don't always hear from the criminal justice reform movement, is the recognition that when you live in Albany, New York, or some small town, and it's a public or a private facility, and that's the only job you have, it's a union job, it's a good paying job, you know, the criminal justice reform movement has to come up and recognize that if we care about the well-being of all communities, you know, we need to care about the well-being of the families, of the union families who have those jobs. And if we are looking at real solutions to ending incarceration, part of that has to be talking about the fact that we're fighting over some crumbs of good paying jobs here, which are prison jobs. And we need to look beyond those jobs and say, what could we spend that same money on that are jobs that provide other opportunities for people to make a living and take care of their families.
Let me just say one other thing too. You know, I work for AFSCME. AFSCME is not the Teamsters. We're not the Peace Officers Association in California. Those are different unions. Every union, you know, has its own policies, procedures, resolutions that it passes, et cetera, et cetera. So I can't speak for what the California Peace Officers Association does in California. They're a whole separate organization. We don't work with them.
Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Damian Bascom. I'm one of the activists in our community here in District of Columbia and PG County, raising awareness around mass incarceration and the criminal injustice we occupy. My question is I know that it's a hard line of accountability there, but we're in the issue. This is my question when it comes into people being incarcerated. How can we change the development or the dealings with the rehabilitation process that's supposed to go on with the inmates that do go in? And then the other question is some advice that how we can create a stronger voice in our community, or how we can get more active to combat with this. I know we combating with capital, in which one of the things with these large prison industrial, prisons, they have lobbyists. And so how do we, my advice is with the movement, how do we develop a platform where we can start holding these and start doing our own lobbying and campaigning along with this movement as an activist group. And then thank you all for putting this on ACLU and coming out here and having this event. But those two questions I would.
Well, I can give you an answer. I'm not sure it'll be helpful. Just because I speak from the faith perspective, our approach to all of this is to, and again, the thing that we were at the Proctor Conference, we actually brought 45 United Methodists from across the country who are engaged in some form of ministry, restorative justice, criminal justice ministry among people who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system. And from there, that emanates, for us, we believe that anything that we build, anything that we do, has to emanate first and foremost from relationships directly with those who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system. So any kind of advocacy first begins, and we believe that theologically, missiologically, biblically, this is the way that's most effective, has to begin from incarnation, from knowing and experiencing and seeing from the perspective of those who are directly impacted. So, from and then seeing, from the chair, our office is right down the street. So I work in DC. I work with good folks that work on these issues. I can tell you this, that there are lobbying forces. There's a very strong lobbying force. I mean, Nikichi talked about, from Open Society, kind of chairs our Justice Roundtable, which brings together a lot of these folks that work together on these issues. There's a very strong lobbying force. I think the one thing, and I don't say this as any kind of like a warning or anything that is in danger of happening, but I can say that there are times when DC groups sometimes experience a disconnect from what's happening on the ground. I don't see that happening, quite frankly. I really don't. I'm not just saying it because I work in DC, but you can take it with a grain of salt. But I do see that there is a strong connection. But again, from the faith perspective, our goal is to build movements among United Methodists first and foremost, among people, working people who are incarnated with people who are experiencing the brokenness of the criminal justice system, and then coordinate a lot of that work and provide, opportunities for the gap that oftentimes does exist between offices here in DC that are working on legislation and the fact that there are thousands upon thousands of people of faith, millions of people of faith that are working on these issues that care very deeply, and to try and provide something that can communicate the direct service that people express. Because when people see a broken system and they see people impacted by the broken system, their first, I can just tell you from the United Methodist perspective, their first response is not, oh, I need to call my senator, I need to call my representative. Their first response is, how do I give, where do I serve, who do I care for? I mean, that's how people respond. So we're working on it, it's always in process, about how do we take that language and amplify it and coordinate it to where it becomes powerful enough and understandable enough to folks that are here in DC working on legislation, so that they know that there are not just a couple of people, not just a couple, and I know, and I'm not saying this about all activists, not just a couple of activist nuts that like to write letters all the time. No offense to you or any other activist in the audience. Just to the nuts. But that there's not just isolated folks, but there really is a movement that's multi-generational, that sees this firsthand, and that is working to bridge that what I believe is a communication divide between service that expresses people's real concern and political power that really does move people in their votes, move people in their views, and cause them to say, before I take this vote, I need to consider what this group of people are saying. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, but we're going to have to continue to build on it because it's a work in progress.
It is.
Yes. Hi, Mike Tartaglia with the National Prison Project. I have two questions. First is for Mr. Miller specifically. I was wondering if you have any statistics on staff to prisoner ratios for adult institutions, private versus public. And then secondly, to the broader panel, Ms. Velazquez sort of alluded to this, talking about Stasia Hilton, who's now the director of the U.S. Marshal Service. But I was wondering if anybody could sort of talk about the revolving door between the industry, the lobbying groups that support them, and governments that they contract with, and then how that impacts oversight and accountability.
First of all, the staffing ratios, I'll give you a card, and I don't have that with me, but I can certainly follow up with you on that. Let me just say real quickly to give you a quick example of what you're talking about. In New Mexico, the former head of the Department of Corrections is named Joe Williams. Joe Williams used to be employed by the GEO Group. When Richardson came in, he brought him in and made him head of the DOC. The GEO Group and CCA were understaffing their facilities. There was chronic understaffing, and there was language in the contract for the state to find those companies. Well, don't you know that Joe Williams, the former GEO employee, did not find those companies? New Mexico has a new governor now, so Joe Williams is out now. Obviously, new governor comes in, he brings in his new head of the DOC. Do you know where Joe Williams works now? He works back at the GEO.
I'm shocked.
And then the second part, the revolving door, anyone care to address that?
Like, how do we fix it?
Sure.
I don't know. I guess it gets partly to accountability. I mean, it seemed like when, at least on the federal level, when this administration came in, you had this sense that they wanted to shut this revolving door, but I don't think that that's happened. I mean, Stacia Hilton was a consultant to GEO Group, making a six-figure salary. I don't know what she was consulting on exactly, but I'm going to guess that's another word for lobbying. And she was hired to be the head of the Marshal Service. I don't know how, I don't know what the answer is, because we see it at, I was just going through, I don't know if Paul's still back there or not, but, we've got in ours, like, several examples, but at some point you have to stop because you start looking like conspiracy theorists, But, I mean, you're right, it's a huge problem. I mean, it's a problem in a lot of industries. I don't know why it just seems particularly wrong to me here. I mean, you see it in the Department of Agriculture. But I think it's just inherent right now in the system. I'm not sure how to, I don't know if you have an answer. But we've seen, I mean, it's at the federal and the state level right now.
I mean, I think it's just another reason to reduce our reliance on these private prison companies. And of course, the latest example is Harley Lappin, the former head of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. While he was the director, he was the lead author in, I think, 2005, a study on that compared the Taft Institution, a privately operated facility, with other BOP institutions, and found many problems, many ways in which the private facility performed deficiently compared to publicly operated ones. He now works for CCA, and a few weeks ago, as Tracy mentioned in her presentation, wrote the letter to 48 governors asking them to sell state prisons to CCA to privatize them.
I know in Montana, the head of the Department of Corrections just went to go work for, I think, CCA. I mean, it happens, it's all the time. And what they'll say is, well, they have the experience that we're looking for to improve our facilities, but usually that means that they just happen to also know everybody in the State House and in the legislature, and certainly helps, grease the skids.
It's a real problem in New Mexico. There was a time when the head Democrat in the legislature actually had a side job as a lobbyist for the GOP at the same time. So we're not even talking about when somebody has left the position. They're part of the legislature and they're working for the private prison firm at the same time. His name is Manny Aragon, in case anybody wants to look at him.
Yes, sir.
I've heard that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that 50% of DC residents or DC people who are convicted of crimes have to go to for-profit prison. And if that's true, what are we doing to change that? Because that's obviously a big issue.
You're testing me because I think you're talking about the initial legislation when Clinton was leaving and Bush came to office, and the time that you were talking about when they were beginning to move folks out of the district. I think that may have been in the legislation.
It's the 1997 Privatization Act.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that may have been in there, that they needed, a certain percentage needed to be in the private facilities. I think you're right. What do we do about it?
There's a
Really
hearing.
more, are we doing it?
Are we doing anything about it? We're not, yeah. No, unfortunately, there's nothing that I know of being done specifically about that, but that's a legitimate issue that needs to be addressed. And I'm glad you're reminding me. I mean, that is an issue that needs to be addressed. Not saying that, not to discount you, it is something that perhaps we need to look at.
There is a hearing on the 29th with Bill Mendelssohn regarding the CIC, which is the Correction Information Council, which was supposed to give oversight to that. However, I mean, we've been going to hearings for a long time. So, let's see.
Maybe that's something the federal folks in the room can look at as well.
Further questions, comments? Yes.
I just wanted to make one comment that, address Charlie, but he's actually left. The question of are the unions on our side? I have to say, I have to stand up for the unions, surprising. I have to stand up for the prison guard unions because when I was up here on the Hill, and I worked on the Hill, Phil Glover from AFGE was in my office consistently, very supportive of reform of the crack cocaine law. In fact, if you look back in that packet of letters that we sent, that were sent up, and at the very end, when we're trying to push the bill through, AFG has a letter of support in that bill. He was very consistent about his support. He was always coming to Scott and talk to Representative Scott about his support for sentencing reform. So,
thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? All right, well, please join me in thanking our panelists. And thanks very much to all of you for being with us this afternoon.